The property sat in silence, swallowed by the kind of darkness that makes even seasoned officers uneasy. The house looked abandoned, its walls weather-beaten, its frames sagging under years of neglect. Deputies swept across the frozen yard, flashlights cutting narrow paths through the cold Wisconsin night. They began with the outbuildings, the barns, the sheds. Standard procedure, though none of them were prepared for what they were about to uncover. Before we begin, let me know where you're joining from tonight. Your voice matters in stories like this. Share it in the comments. And if you value real cases told with respect, consider subscribing. Inside one of the sheds, a deputy's beam caught something hanging from the rafters. At first glance it seemed ordinary, a deer maybe, strung up for butchering, just like you'd find on any rural property. But as the officer stepped closer, the shape resolved into something horribly wrong. It wasn't a deer at all. It was human. It was Bernice Worden, the missing woman they'd been searching for. The shock rippled through the scene like electricity. Within minutes, Sheriff Schley was on site, securing the perimeter. Whatever faint hope had existed that Bernice might be found alive ended there. But what no one realized yet was that her discovery was only the beginning. The true horror waited inside the house. When deputies forced the farmhouse door open, the stench hit them first. Rot, filth, and something they couldn't quite name. Their flashlights swept through a suffocating maze of decay. Newspapers, dishes, and debris piled high. Years of grime coated every surface. The air felt thick, as though the house itself had stopped breathing long ago. It wasn't just dirty. It was collapsing under the weight of neglect and madness. Then came the details that would haunt them forever. In room after room, they found objects that would never have existed, furniture built from unthinkable materials, household items fashioned with an unholy imagination. The rooms Augusta Gein had once occupied were sealed tight, untouched, preserved like a shrine to a woman long gone, while the rest of the home had decayed into something unspeakable. The deputies tried to stay clinical, noting each discovery without emotion, cataloguing what they saw in the cold language of law enforcement. But no report could soften what the farmhouse revealed, a workshop of the macabre, where the border between the living and the dead no longer existed. What struck the officers most wasn't just the horror of what they found, but how ordinary it all appeared to Ed Gein. The filth, the chaos, the decay. This was his normal. His home told the story of a man who had lived in isolation for years, keeping his mother's memory frozen in untouched rooms while the rest of his world crumbled around him. Many of the men who entered that night carried the memory for the rest of their lives. These were farmers, hunters, small-town officers used to accidents and violence, but none of them had ever seen anything like the Gein house. The discovery of Bernice Worden's body confirmed the crime at hand, yet the evidence inside expanded the story far beyond a single act. It revealed a pattern, years in the making, one that would soon redefine American crime itself. When investigators finally sat across from Ed Gein, they didn't meet the wild-eyed monster the newspapers would later create. They found a soft-spoken, polite man, almost timid. He answered their questions calmly, as though confessing minor misbehavior instead of describing the unthinkable. He spoke with strange clarity at times. He told them, almost casually, how he robbed graves. He described the nights he'd drive out to cemeteries under the moon, scanning the fresh soil of recent burials, returning with shovels and tools. He admitted exhuming bodies, specifically women who resembled his mother, Augusta. He said it without hesitation, without remorse, as though he were discussing farm chores. But when detectives pressed about murder, his certainty splintered. He admitted shooting Mary Hogan, then paused. "I don't remember," he'd mutter. Sometimes he denied it altogether. The same happened with Bernice Worden. One moment he confessed. The next, he claimed confusion. The investigators couldn't tell if he was hiding the truth or genuinely lost inside his own fractured mind. What unsettled them most wasn't what he said, but how he said it. Ed Gein never raised his voice. He addressed officers as Sir, spoke with courtesy, and displayed no anger, no shame. The acts he described, digging, cutting, sewing, carried no emotional weight in his tone. To him they were simply part of a grim routine. When asked why he'd done it, his answers shifted like sand. Sometimes curiosity, sometimes loneliness, sometimes an urge to feel close to his mother, and other times no explanation at all, just a shrug. It was as though morality had evaporated from his vocabulary. Detectives soon realized his detachment was almost total. He could explain the mechanics of his acts, the tools, the timing, the method, but never the meaning. When they pushed him to acknowledge right or wrong, he simply returned to practical details. The more they listened, the clearer it became. They were hearing a man who described horror as if reading from a to-do list. Psychologists would later debate whether Ed Gein suffered memory loss, psychosis, or deliberate evasion. But to the men in the Basit tea room, it didn't matter. What they heard chilled them to the bone. A polite, almost gentle voice, recounting acts that defied comprehension. As questioning continued, Gein spoke more about the items found in his home. He didn't deny their origins. He said plainly that many came from cemeteries. He detailed how he'd chosen graves, women who reminded him of Augusta, and how he'd dig them up within days of burial before the ground froze solid. His descriptions were specific. The tools, the timing, even the rows of graves. At first, deputies didn't believe him. Grave robbing repeatedly in a small community like Plainfield, it sounded impossible. But when Sheriff Schley ordered quiet checks of the sites Ed named, the impossible became undeniable. Fresh soil disturbed, coffins pried open, remains missing. Each location matched his claims. These were not fantasies. They were facts, and they shook the town to its core. Ed's explanations came with the same eerie calm. He claimed something drew him to those graves, a pull he couldn't resist. He spoke of lifting bodies and bringing them home, describing the process as if he were restoring furniture rather than desecrating the dead. His obsession always circled back to Augusta. The women he chose resembled her in age or build. Whether or not he said it outright, his actions revealed the truth. He was trying to rebuild her, to bring her back in fragments. For Plainfield, this revelation was a second devastation. Families who had buried loved ones now faced a horror worse than loss: violation. The sacred peace of the cemetery had been shattered in silence. Whispers spread through the town, then turned to fear. For generations, people here had trusted that the dead were left in peace. Now they couldn't even trust that. The image of Ed Gein, quiet, polite, even helpful, walking through those graveyards at night with a shovel in hand, became an image that Plainfield would never erase. The investigation had begun with one missing woman. It had uncovered something far deeper, a years-long descent into madness, grief and obsession. The farmhouse, the graveyards, the sealed rooms, all pieces of a mind consumed by one haunting figure, Augusta Gein. When the story broke, America would recoil in disbelief. But for the people of Plainfield, this wasn't a legend. It was their neighbor, the man who repaired their tools, who smiled at the store counter, who lived quietly on the edge of town. And no one, not even the officers who first stepped onto that dark property, would ever forget what they found there. Snow had begun to fall outside the county jail when investigators transferred Ed Gein to the state hospital for psychiatric evaluation. In Plainfield, people still whispered his name like a curse. They couldn't bring themselves to picture him behind bars. It was easier to imagine him gone completely, locked away from the world that he had turned upside down. But the doctors who met Ed Gein didn't see a monster right away. They saw a puzzle. A soft-spoken man with a childlike manner, sitting calmly in his chair as if unaware of the storm surrounding him. He smiled when spoken to, answered politely, and seemed oddly cooperative. Yet behind that mild demeanor, something was fractured, something deep enough to erase the lines between fantasy and reality. The psychiatrists began with simple questions: his family, his childhood, his daily routines. He answered everything as though the details were ordinary. He talked about his mother with reverence. "She was pure," he said, "the best woman who ever lived." Every sentence about Augusta was drenched in devotion, but also in something darker, dependence that had never faded, even after her death. As they dug deeper, the doctors began to see how completely she had shaped him. Augusta Gein had raised her son under a strict and punishing moral code. She called the world sinful, wicked, full of temptations that led straight to damnation. Women, especially, she taught him, were dangerous, except for herself, the only one he could trust. Ed grew up believing his mother's words were absolute truth. Her judgment defined right and wrong, and her approval was the only love he ever understood. When she died, that structure collapsed. The boy who had never left his mother's shadow was suddenly alone in a world she had told him to fear. The psychiatrists saw in Ed not just a criminal, but a man broken by grief, a man who never learned to separate love from possession or memory from obsession. Under observation, Ed's behavior was strangely predictable. He read magazines, did light chores, spoke softly with staff. But when conversation turned toward his crimes, he seemed to drift. Sometimes he admitted things clearly. Other times, he slipped into confusion or claimed he couldn't recall details at all. It was as if parts of his memory had been sealed away, locked behind a door he no longer had the key to. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia, specifically a form that blended delusion and detachment from reality. He showed signs of psychosis, but not the violent rage one might expect. His crimes had been committed not from anger, they believed, but from a warped attempt to repair something missing inside him. His mind, they concluded, had been trying to resurrect the one person who defined his world, Augusta. They examined the items recovered from his house again, not as evidence but as artifacts of obsession. Each one carried meaning: the furniture, the masks, the preserved remains, all symbols of control, reconstruction, and ritual. Ed Gein's horrors weren't the random acts of a killer. They were the creations of a man lost in his own mythology, where death and love had become indistinguishable. During one session, when asked what he remembered most about his mother, Ed's eyes softened. "She was always right," he said quietly. "If she'd lived longer, none of this would have happened." It was the single sentence that to the doctors explained everything. He wasn't capable of understanding guilt, only loss. When the time came to determine if he could stand trial, the question wasn't whether Ed Gein was guilty, but whether he was sane enough to comprehend what he'd done. The psychiatrists argued he was not. His mind was too fractured, his grip on reality too thin. In their eyes, Ed wasn't manipulating anyone. He was lost, drifting in the ruins of his own thoughts. The court ruled him mentally incompetent to stand trial, and in 1958, Ed Gein was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. For Plainfield, the decision felt like an insult. Many wanted him punished, not treated. But to the doctors, there was no punishment severe enough to reach a man who didn't understand the concept of guilt. Life at the hospital became routine. Ed spent his days reading, drawing, and helping with small tasks. He was quiet, well-mannered, even kind to staff. The nurses described him as cooperative, never violent, never disruptive. In a controlled environment, he posed no threat, but beneath that calm exterior, his obsessions never fully vanished. Staff occasionally found sketches, distorted faces, fragments of anatomy, scribbled notes about making things whole. They kept them locked away, fearing they'd provoke panic if made public. Outside the walls of the hospital, the world was changing. The 1960s brought new forms of media, new fascination with the macabre, and Ed Gein's name began to echo far beyond Wisconsin. The details of his crimes inspired books, then films, and eventually entire genres. Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lamb, each carried fragments of his story. But for the real man, none of that mattered. Ed never saw himself as infamous. He told doctors he was doing fine, occasionally asking about Plainfield or whether his house was still standing. It wasn't. In 1958, before the trial even began, his farmhouse burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered that townspeople had set it ablaze, determined to erase the nightmare from their landscape. When Ed heard about it, his response was simple. "Just as well," he said. It was a bad place. Years passed. Ed grew older, quieter, almost ghost-like within the hospital walls. Staff turnover meant that new nurses sometimes didn't even recognize the name Ed Gein until they looked up his file. To them, he was just another elderly patient, polite and compliant. But for the few who remembered the early days, his presence carried a strange gravity. A reminder that beneath that calm exterior was a history that reshaped how America viewed evil itself. In 1968, after a decade of confinement, doctors reassessed Ed's condition. They found him lucid, cooperative, and able to understand legal proceedings. For the first time, he was declared competent to stand trial. It would be brief, clinical, and quiet, the final act of a story that had already horrified the world. The trial of Ed Gein began on November 7, 1968, in Wautoma, Wisconsin. By then, the frenzy had faded. The courtroom was small, the audience limited. Reporters still attended, but even they sensed that the spectacle was over. The man sitting before the judge wasn't a monstrous figure. He was pale, aging, almost fragile. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses. Ed was charged with one count, the murder of Bernice Worden. The case of Mary Hogan was left unproven, and the grave robberies, while verified, were treated as symptoms of his illness rather than separate crimes. The defense entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution did not contest it. The evidence was overwhelming, but the intent was murky. The question was never what Ed had done, but why. And the why could only be answered by the doctors who testified. They described a man trapped between devotion and delusion, a man whose mother's voice had become louder in death than it ever was in life. The acts he committed, they said, were expressions of a disordered mind, trying to restore what it had lost. After just 1 week, the judge delivered the verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Ed Gein was returned to the Central State Hospital, this time permanently. For Plainfield, the verdict brought no closure. Some residents wanted him executed, others simply wanted to forget. But forgetting proved impossible. His story had already escaped their borders, seeping into popular culture, retold and reimagined until the man himself became a symbol, a reflection of America's darkest curiosity. Yet, behind the myth, the real Ed Gein lived on quietly in institutional care. He tended the garden, ate meals with other patients, and read the Bible often. Staff described him as gentle, almost meek. He never spoke about his crimes again, nor did he show signs of remorse or reflection. It was as if those memories existed in another world, one he had permanently sealed away. Decades passed. The world that once feared him moved on to new scandals, new villains. But in Plainfield, the scar never fully healed. Locals still avoided the empty fields where his house once stood. Parents warned children not to wander too far. The legend lingered, not as superstition, but as memory. Ed Gein died in 1984, at the age of 77, in Mendota Mental Health Institute. The cause was respiratory failure. He was buried beside his mother in Plainfield Cemetery, the same ground where he had disturbed so many others. Over time, visitors chipped pieces from his headstone until it was removed entirely to prevent vandalism. Today, his grave lies unmarked, a simple patch of earth among hundreds, indistinguishable from the rest. But even without a marker, the story of Ed Gein remains carved deep into American folklore, not because of his crimes alone, but because of what they revealed about loneliness, grief, and obsession. Beneath the horror, there was a tragic truth. A man who couldn't let go of the only person he'd ever loved, and in trying to bring her back, lost himself completely. When the news of Ed Gein's death quietly appeared in the papers in 1984, the world didn't erupt in outrage or celebration. It exhaled. For nearly 3 decades, his name had hovered like a shadow over American imagination, a ghost of a man who blurred the line between grief and horror. But even in death, Ed Gein refused to disappear. What he left behind was more than a case file or a police report. He left behind an idea, a cautionary echo that would ripple through culture, art, and the way America understood evil itself. Plainfield never recovered fully. By the time the 80s arrived, the little town looked the same on the surface. Its quiet streets, frozen winters, cornfields stretching into the horizon, but to those who lived there nothing felt normal. People avoided even mentioning his name. The locals called it the incident, as if refusing to say it aloud could weaken its power. The children who'd grown up hearing stories about the farmhouse of horrors were adults now. Some still lived nearby, unable to sell their family land. Others moved away and refused to come back. Yet for all the silence, curiosity still crept in. Visitors arrived, quietly asking for directions to the old Gein property, taking photographs where the house had burned down. There was nothing to see, just empty soil, but somehow that emptiness carried a story stronger than any monument. It was the birth of true crime tourism long before the term existed. People came searching for answers, or maybe for the strange thrill of standing near a place where reality had once fractured. The town hated it, but the fascination never stopped. Hollywood was listening too. Writers and filmmakers, caught between disgust and fascination, found in Gein's story the perfect reflection of America's growing obsession with what hides behind ordinary faces. In 1960, just 3 years after the discovery in Plainfield, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho. The quiet motel, the overbearing mother, the lonely man with the hollow stare. It was a mirror of Ed Gein's reality, reshaped through fiction. Norman Bates became the first of many cinematic descendants, men whose crimes were driven not by hatred, but by longing, confusion, and the desperate need to fill a void left by someone they couldn't let go. Then came Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, his grotesque masks echoing the chilling artifacts police found in Gein's home. Later, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, 1991, borrowed the idea of transformation, a killer trying to remake himself into something he believed he wasn't. Each of these characters took fragments of Ed Gein's reality and turned them into myth, distorting it, amplifying it, reimagining it for audiences who could consume in safety what once had been too terrifying to face. Gein's story became entertainment, a dark parable that people could turn off when the credits rolled. But the truth behind it remained far more tragic than thrilling. Ed Gein's crimes arrived at a time when America was just beginning to wrestle with the idea of the serial killer. Before Plainfield, violence of that nature was considered impossible in small towns. Monsters belonged in fiction, not in real life. But when investigators walked into that farmhouse, they uncovered something society wasn't ready to accept: that evil could grow quietly in the most familiar of places. There was no city darkness, no criminal underworld, just isolation, grief, and obsession festering in a man everyone thought they knew. After Gein, the public's relationship with crime changed forever. Reporters started digging deeper. Psychologists began studying patterns of behavior and trauma. Law enforcement agencies started cataloging cases across states. In time, that groundwork would help identify and track future killers like Bundy, Dahmer, and Gacy. In a twisted way, the horror of Plainfield had sparked progress. It forced America to look directly at what it didn't want to see. That mental illness, when left untreated and unseen, could turn into something catastrophic. Even decades later, what makes Ed Gein's story so haunting isn't the gore or the headlines. It's the contradiction, how someone so mild, so seemingly ordinary, could carry such darkness inside. He wasn't the raging, snarling villain of the movies. He was quiet, polite, almost gentle. That gap between appearance and reality is what continues to unsettle people to this day. Experts often describe him as a product of isolation, a man shaped by a domineering mother, imprisoned by guilt, and warped by loneliness. Others say he represents the danger of mythologizing evil, turning human tragedy into legend until the real victims fade away. Because beyond all the fascination, there were real people whose lives ended in pain, Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, and countless families disturbed by the desecration of graves. For every book or movie inspired by Gein, their names deserve to be remembered louder. They are the reason this story matters, not the horror he created, but the lives it destroyed. In the years after Ed Gein's death, Plainfield's identity became inseparable from his name. Some towns tried to embrace it, hoping to attract tourists. Others tried to bury it forever. But the truth lingered quietly, woven into every local conversation that ended in uncomfortable silence. The field where his house once stood grew wild again. The ashes mixed with snow, then grass, until no trace remained. Children who played nearby sometimes whispered they could still feel a heaviness in the air, a weight that didn't belong to weather or time. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was memory. Some wounds never quite close. They just learn to hide beneath the surface. For Wisconsin, Ed Gein became both a warning and a mirror. Proof that small-town innocence could break, and that beneath the comfort of everyday life, there are people quietly unraveling. Every community has its secrets. Plainfield's just happened to change the world's understanding of what horror could look like. After Gein, newspapers and later television discovered something powerful. Audiences couldn't look away. Not from the crime itself, but from the why. Why did it happen? What turns an ordinary person into someone capable of unthinkable acts? Those questions gave birth to modern true crime storytelling. Writers, journalists, and later documentarians began approaching these stories not only as entertainment, but as studies of psychology, sociology, and empathy. Gein's case became a template, one that asked creators to balance horror with understanding and spectacle with respect. Even decades later, content creators, filmmakers, and investigators still struggle with that balance. How do you tell a story like Ed Gein's without glorifying it? How do you honor victims while confronting the evil that took them? For channels like Blacklight Investigation, those questions define the mission: to tell real stories with respect, to shed light without sensationalism, to remember that behind every headline is a human life that mattered. The deeper lesson of Ed Gein isn't about violence, it's about neglect. About what happens when someone lives for years unseen, unheard, unhealed. Mental illness in rural America was rarely spoken of in the 1950s. There were no check-ins, no community outreach, no therapy sessions. When his mother died, Ed was left in silence. And silence is where the worst thoughts take root. If anything can be learned from this story, it's that monsters are not born fully formed. They're shaped slowly, by trauma, isolation, and a lifetime of pain ignored. Understanding that truth doesn't excuse what happened, but it helps prevent the next tragedy. It reminds us to listen before it's too late. Today, Ed Gein's grave lies unmarked in Plainfield Cemetery. No flowers, no headstone, no sign that the man who inspired half a century of horror films rests there. Only those who know the map can find the spot, a quiet patch of grass near his mother's grave. Visitors sometimes stand in silence, not out of reverence, but reflection. They stare at the empty space and think about what his life became, how love twisted into obsession, how isolation bred delusion, and how grief turned into something unrecognizable. In that stillness, one truth becomes clear. Ed Gein's story isn't about monsters hiding in the dark. It's about what happens when we stop seeing one another at all. Nearly 70 years later, the echoes of Plainfield still influence how we tell stories about fear. His case changed the way police investigate, how psychiatrists diagnose, how journalists report. It altered the tone of horror films, shifting them from supernatural to psychological, and it forced society to confront an uncomfortable question, that evil doesn't always come from strangers or shadows. Sometimes it grows quietly next door. But amid all the legends and retellings, one message deserves to rise above the rest, that beneath the spectacle there are victims whose stories deserve peace and lessons that demand attention. Not every ghost wears a mask or swings a blade. Some haunt us as reminders of empathy we forgot to offer. As night falls over Plainfield, the fields whisper with wind again. There's no house, no sign of the chaos that once lived there. Just earth, reclaimed by time, a chassis, and the distant sound of a world that moved on. Yet for those who still study the case, for every journalist, investigator, and storyteller who speaks his name, the purpose is no longer to sensationalize, but to understand. Because if Ed Gein's story teaches us anything, it's that ignoring pain does not make it disappear. It festers, it mutates, and sometimes it explodes in ways no one can predict. Telling these stories is how we make sense of that darkness, how we make sure it never hides unnoticed again. In the end, Plainfield wasn't just the site of a crime. It was the birthplace of a warning that beneath the quietest lives, whole storms can rage unseen. In the end, Ed Gein's story isn't just about darkness. It's about what silence can create. Plainfield learned too late that monsters don't always arrive with warnings. Sometimes they grow in plain sight, shaped by grief, obsession, and isolation. Tonight, as we close this story, remember the names that mattered most: Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. Their voices were lost, but they should never be forgotten. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you for listening with respect. These aren't just tales of horror. They're reminders of what happens when empathy disappears. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, because stories like this reach farther than we know. And if you value truth told with care, subscribe to Blacklight Investigation. Because every story we uncover brings a little more light to the dark.